Hi, Mr. Wicklehouse here, and today we are simplifying radicals with negative radicands. And this is your beginning steps to working with complex numbers. What in the world are complex numbers, you might be asking me? Oh my lord, starting with complex numbers. Now you may have heard the words imaginary numbers before. Well, that is what complex numbers are. So, when a real number is squared, it always ends up being positive. So, like if I've got negative 2 times negative 2, that's going to be a positive 4. This is the same as negative 2 quantity squared. Negative 2 times negative 2, positive. Remember, when we square, it's the same number being multiplied by itself twice. So, when we multiply these things together, they're always positive, because a negative and a negative is a positive, positive and a positive is a positive, always positive. Well, when we start working with square roots and things with even roots, so square root, fourth root, sixth root, so on and so forth, I can put negative numbers underneath of these radicals as so. Square root, negative 4. Well, I need a way to deal with that. And to do that, I use imaginary numbers. And they take the form of a real number b times I. And it happens when a number is squared and it ends up being negative. We know that can't really happen. So in the craziness of our own math minds, we just do this imaginary situation. Okay. Also, a step further, complex numbers are numbers that have a real part and an imaginary part. And they are written in the form of a plus bi, or you might see them as a minus bi. And in the next unit, when we start dealing with quadratics, you'll see the complex numbers always happen in pairs. They have to. They're never just a number by itself, unless you're just working with expressions. But when we actually start solving things, they always happen in pairs. Okay. Well, what does that number I mean? What's the representation of that? The imaginary number I equals the square root of negative 1. Okay? It is also important to recognize that if I take I squared, or the square root of negative 1 squared, then I get negative 1. But we'll talk more about that in another video. Okay? So, let's do a couple examples here. This is the idea. So I've got the square root of negative 9. Well, if it was the square root of 9, we would know how to deal with that. It would just be 3 because 9 is a perfect square. But because this negative under here, there's a negative under here, it makes it more difficult. Just slightly more. So, I know the square root of negative 9 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times 9. Right? Negative 1 times 9 is negative 9. We know that. Well, if you remember, when we multiply square roots, it's just putting radicands together. There go the lights. I know you guys love when the lights go out. See if I can get them to come back on. They're going to come back on, lights? There we go. Lights came back on. Sorry about that. I know you guys get super excited when that happens. Think the video's over. Anyway, as I was saying, negative 1 times 9, when we multiply radicals together, we multiply the radicands together. So I can undo that and get the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9. Well, now I know what to do here, because the square root of 9 is 3. And I know, because Mr. Wicklehouse just talked about it, that I equals the square root of negative 1. So, here's the square root of negative 1. that is going to be the letter I. So the answer to this is 3i. Alrighty. Let's do another example. What's the square root of 81? Well, 81 breaks down into 9 and 9. There's a pair. 81's a perfect square. So the square root of 81 is 9. That's not imaginary. That's real. There were no negatives under here, so we're good on that. But then I've got square root of negative 36. I know that the square root of negative 36 is the same as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. Well, 36 is 6 times 6. So then, that's a perfect square. So the square root of that is 6. And I know that the square root of negative 1 is I. So if I have a problem like this, I get 9 plus 6i. Easy peasy. And that's all you're doing. You're making it so that when you're taking the negative and you're turning it into negative 1. Then you simplify the rest of the radical like normal. And then you take whatever this ends up being and put it in front of the I. And that's it. Okay? And that is the end of this video. I will talk to you later.